Since my subject is the Hebrew alphabet, I'm sure some of you, or even most of you, know something about it. But I would like to tell you something from my angle of vision of the Hebrew alphabet. And I would like to start with a very short description of a legend from the book of Zohar. There's a beautiful legend about how God created the world. And at the beginning, when God tried to create the world, of course, he was talking with all his angels. And of course, the language that God spoke with the angels is, of course, they knew no other language but the Hebrew language. So God spoke to them in Hebrew. And when God talked to the angels, the first thing that happened to God is that there was a group of 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet who came to God, and each and every one of them wanted to be the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And somebody who made beautiful illustrations and did it, unfortunately, in English and not in Hebrew, is a Jewish American artist by the name of Ben Shan. And what you see here on the board, on the screen, is his illustrations for the 22 letters speaking to God. And 20 letters came to God, and each and every one of them tried to tell God that she or he is the first to be in the Hebrew alphabet. And finally, there were two letters in waiting. One of them was the letter Bet. And God spoke to the letter Bet and said, why were you silent so far? And she said to God that all the other letters really talked about themselves, and she has nothing to say about herself. So God said to her, because you were so modest and because you were so fine, I'm going to make you the first letter of the Bible. And the word Bereshit, or in the beginning, begins with the letter Bet. So this is how Bet got to be the first letter of the Hebrew Bible. And then the letter Aleph was still there. And God said to the letter Aleph, why didn't you or anything about yourself? And the letter Aleph said that all the 21 other letters have already spoken, and she has nothing to say. So God said to her, I've already given the letter Bet to be the first letter in the Hebrew Bible. So God said to the letter Aleph, you are going to be the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And Aleph is still to this very day the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So this legend was very well known to many artists, and just I'm showing you three examples of tapestries made by an Israeli artist called Mordechai Ardon, and he also made his homage to this legend from the Zohar with tapestries with the letters of the alphabet. So after we began with the beautiful legend of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, I would like to put your attention, some of you probably know the Hebrew alphabet. And, you know that the modern, as we can call it, this is the modern Hebrew alphabet that you see on top. But there was also an ancient Hebrew alphabet. And if you ask me, as a reader and writer of Hebrew, to read the ancient Hebrew alphabet, I will not be able to do it because this is from ancient times. And only archaeologists and maybe historians can read the ancient Hebrew alphabet. And I'm showing you one example that you can see the ancient Hebrew alphabet on a coin from the 3rd century. You can see that the ancient Hebrew alphabet, and again I'm saying that I am not able to read it, only archaeologists can do that. The Hebrew alphabet, later on, I'm taking you 1,000 years after the 3rd century, or maybe 800 years after the and the modern, as you can say, which is almost 2,000 years old, the modern Hebrew alphabet was based on the Aramaic Hebrew alphabet. And what I'm showing you here is that when we come to the Middle Ages, there were many books that were written in Hebrew. And you would have scribes, or the people who would write the calligraphy of the Hebrew alphabet. And there were two kinds of Hebrew alphabet. One is called Ashkenazi, which comes from Western Europe, from countries like Germany or France, let's say. And the other one was Sephardic Hebrew alphabet, as the calligraphers would write it. And it comes basically from Spain and later on from North Africa and places like this. And they're basically almost the same, but I think that since I'm going to talk to you about some visual aspects of the Hebrew alphabet, if you look on the right, this is the Ashkenazi writing, and the scribe, or the person who would hold the pen in his hand, or she, they would hold it in a 90-degree angle and do the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And if you look at the Sephardic Hebrew alphabet, the scribe would hold the pen in a 45-degree angle. And if we look again at the Ashkenazi handwriting, it is more block-like. It is like in a square. And when you look at the Sephardic Hebrew lettering, it is more flowing. It has more rhythm to it. If we look, I'm just giving you a few examples of manuscripts or books written by hand. Of course, I'm talking to you about the time before the invention of the printing press. So everything was done by hand. And this, you can recognize now, is Ashkenazi Hebrew handwriting. One of the things that one can say about the Hebrew handwriting as opposed to Latin handwriting is that in Hebrew you don't have capital letters. All the letters in the written book would be the same letters, and there is no capital or not initial letters. Since I like to look very carefully at certain things, sometimes it is very nice to discover that even scribes or even those people who wrote the Hebrew manuscripts were only human and they could make mistakes. So it is very interesting to see what the mistake is. So I'm emphasizing the letter Hey. You see that I put a red circle there. Later on, you can see that the next line also has the letter Hey in Hebrew. And what it means here is that the scribe that was writing this book started with the Hey at the end of the line, but then he realized that it doesn't have enough space, so he put it back he started it in the next line. And the same thing goes to the letter Mem, that you can see that he put the letter Mem and then started the other sentence with the letter Mem again, so he made a mistake. And because of traditional reasons, or maybe for religious reasons, you could not erase the letter, and that's why he left it in both places. Another difference between the Hebrew alphabet or the Hebrew book and books written in Latin or even in Cyrillic letters is that a great tradition was to have an initial letter or a great letter in the beginning of a sentence. And this is the letter B, of course, but you see that it was so important that the scribe gave it a full page for the letter B. And in Hebrew, you do not have an initial letter. So the tradition in Hebrew manuscripts was to have an initial word rather than an initial letter. And I'm showing you two full pages really dedicated to an initial word. And the word is Ashrei here, or blessed he that is doing something. And of course, just by the illustration, you can see that it's the same person that is talking there. You see King David almost in a disguise of Orpheus with the animals, listening to how he is playing on his harp. And the one on the top also shows you King David playing the harp. But this is a full page for an initial word rather than letter. Another example of an initial word. And another one of all the words is lo, 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 on velo, 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 velo. This is from a Passover Haggadah. Okay, and then something that I'd like to show you, how Hebrew scribes or Hebrew, the people who wrote the Hebrew manuscripts were really concerned about the layout of the page. And they were concerned about the margins, that the margins are going to be very, very straight. So what do you do when you have to have two straight lines on both sides? You can do it very well with Hebrew letters. And you can do it with the letter Hey, as I'm showing you now. You can do it with the letter Taf. You can do it with the final letter Mem. And let's see the letter Taf. This is how the letter Taf on the right should be written. But sometimes you can take it and elongate it as long as you want to fill all the space that you need in a page. The same thing goes to the final letter Mem, because the letter Mem is a square, but you can make it into a very, very long Mem. So you can do it with these letters, and you can do it with many other letters, except for certain letters that you cannot do it, because let's say the letter Vav, which if you make it very long, it would look like the letter Resh. So here's an example of a written of calligraphy, and you can see, I mean, this is too small, so I made it big for you, and you can see that the letter Resh on the top and the letter Lamed in the second line, and on the bottom you can see the letter Hey, and this is how the scribe made everything look very, very clean, very, very neat, very, very beautiful in the two very straight margins by enlarging the letters. And again, just a few more examples. You see the letter Resh, the letter Mem, and the letter Hey, and the letter Taf. So far, I talked to you something about manuscripts. I want to show you something about the Hebrew alphabet that is taken from the small format of a book and put into space. And I'm taking you to Spain in the 14th century. I'm taking you to one synagogue. There were about three that we know of, but one synagogue that turned later on into a church. This is called El Tránsito in Toledo in Spain. And you can see that the decoration of the wall is all made of plaster reliefs. And inside all the decorations that look like Islamic patterns or Islamic art from nature, it is all vegetable kind of illustrations. You can see, of course, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet with sentences from the book of Psalms. And what the interesting thing is, from moving from a small format of a book to an architectural format, is that when people or when the Jewish community would come into the synagogue, they were surrounded by these Hebrew sentences or by these Hebrew quotations from the Bible. And even before they started their prayers or reading the Bible or the Torah in the synagogue, they were surrounded by these quotations from the Bible. So it is completely impossible for somebody to come into a certain space, a person who can read and write Hebrew and not read what is going on the wall. So the text becomes a living part of the community who comes to the synagogue. And you will have to excuse my next example, which is from America. And I'm giving you this example because nowadays, in the 21st century, when we talk about installation, we take something for granted. And we walk into the gallery and see the installation by this American artist, Barbara Kruger, and you cannot just stand there and look at the aesthetics of the installation. You have to read it, so you become a participant of the installation with the text. And the same thing was happening 600 years ago, that the text was an integral part of the community, and you could not be a passive person who walks into the synagogue. You had to be very active because you read the text. Something else that has to do with the Hebrew alphabet is something that's called micrography. And this is a very interesting thing for me as a secular person to look at it, because this has to do with Jewish tradition or with Jewish religion, because micrography is really images of, it can be anything. It can be flowers and fruits and landscapes even, but most often it is done in portraits. If you think about the second commandment from the Bible that says that one should not make images, and this second commandment from the Bible was interpreted for the past 2,500, for the past 4,000 years, in many, many, many interpretations, including rabbinical interpretations. One of the interpretations says that one should not make portraits, because portraits are something that you're not supposed to do because it can remind one of the image of God. So an interesting fact is that you have many portraits of rabbis, throughout Jewish history. This is the portrait of the rabbi of Paris from the beginning of the 20th century. So what basically micrography allows a religious person to do is not to look at an image, because what he does or what she does is really reading a text. So far, I talked to you about certain things that people do with their hands. I mean, I was talking about scribes who are writing the text of books before the invention of the press. And as I know very few dates in history, 1492, I know for three reasons. It's because in 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain, Columbus discovered America, and Gutenberg invented the printing press. So since the invention of the printing press, Hebrew also had to be prepared for the printing press because there were no letters before. It was all written by hand. But now with the invention of the printing press, people had to cut letters. In the beginning, as you know, they were cut from wood, and later on they were cast in metal. One of the first Hebrew letters that were cut for the printing press were done by Christoffel van Dyck, in Amsterdam. He was a letter cutter in Amsterdam, and he cut the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and the typeface was called Amsterdam. And if we go 100 years later, there was somebody else, also a letter cutter from Italy, and his name was Bodoni, Giambattista Bodoni, and he cut different Hebrew letters, and they were called the Bodoni Hebrew letters until this very day. And if you can read Hebrew, you will be very easily, you can discern the fact that the Amsterdam is very, very thick, and also very, very, there are no spaces between the letters with the Amsterdam. When you look at the Bodoni, it looked a little more modern in the 18th century because it was more legible. It was easier to read it. It's just like Albrecht Dürer in the 15th century tried to make the Latin alphabet much better for the printing press. He was using a compass and he was using a ruler in order to create a very good and well-designed Latin alphabet. So we come to the 19th century, very close to our era, and there were two new Hebrew typefaces. Of course, because I don't have too much time, there were others, but I just picked up the most important ones. So there's one that was called Meruba. Meruba in Hebrew means square, and it was invented in the 19th century, the early 19th century in Germany. And the other one in the late 19th century, which is the most famous, and I will tell you in a minute, it is the most used Hebrew typeface until this very minute that I'm talking to you, is the Frank Riel typeface. And the Frank Riel was made by or designed by two Jewish designers in Germany in the late 19th century. So this is the Frank Riel that you see on your right. The reason I'm showing you Frank Riel is that when you come to Israel today, which is the only place where people read daily newspapers, let's say, that are printed in Hebrew, what you see there is still using the Frank Riel typeface, although it was done almost 200 years ago. Now I have to remind you that the Hebrew alphabet at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was used by two languages, not only by Hebrew, it was also used by Yiddish. Because in Yiddish, you know that they're using the Hebrew alphabet with no punctuation, but it is still the Hebrew alphabet. So I'm just giving you an example. This is Ellis Island, some kind of music sheets that I found in Yiddish using the Frank Riel typeface. And here is just for fun because this is your native Leonid Pasternak. And he was trying to use the Frank Riel typeface and give it a look of Cyrillic handwriting. Okay. And when you come to Israel today and you're going to a graphic designer and you would like to make a catalog for an exhibition and you would like to make a brochure for something that you want to sell or anything, they go to the computer, and on the computer you have between 50 to 60 or maybe even 70 typefaces. But in the beginning of the 20th century, only about 100 years ago, in 1923, there was one place that was really the most important one in Germany that cast the Hebrew letters, and it had 4 fonts. And you can see I'm just giving you, it had this Berthold letter company had a Hebrew section in it, and this is the introduction for the catalog. But from the catalog you could see that Hebrew designers could buy from this company anything that they wanted to do for their graphic design. Just to give you another example of a Jewish artist who was in Berlin in the 1920s, this is Yosef Budko. And you can tell how he tried to do some modern things with the Hebrew typography. On the top you can see the title of Ha'olam, the world, which was the Zionist journal. And on the bottom you can see what Yosef Budko did with it. There's another thing that I have to remind you of, or to show you. There was something, there was a spring of Hebrew publishing in Berlin in the 1920s all the way to 1933. And one of the very significant journals that they had there was printed in 5 languages, and it was called Milgoim, or pomegranate. And what the Milgoim had was for the new rejuvenating or renaissance of Hebrew culture. They gave all kinds of examples of Hebrew illustrations and Hebrew calligraphy from the Middle Ages. And just one example that I will go very quickly, and I will show you the inside of this publication. A very significant publication in 1923 was the Jubilee edition, or the 50th anniversary edition of poet laureate Chaim Nachman Bialik, designed from top to bottom and from the beginning to the end by Yosef Budko. Okay, so you can see very quickly that I show you how Budko was designing the book to look in a very modern kind of way in the layout or the design for the page. And this was one of the first times that you would have very modern, or I would say even German, typography of the beginning of the 20th century as it is translated into Hebrew. Titles of the poems for Bialik were written by hand by a very intriguing and very interesting typographer and calligrapher, and her name is Franziska Baruch. And Franziska Baruch did this by hand. And you can see the relationship between the handwritten title of the poem with the printed alphabet. In 1906, Boris Schatz came from Bulgaria to Jerusalem, and he established the Bezalel School of Arts and Crafts in Jerusalem that is in existence to this very day. And one of the things that Bezalel was taking upon itself to do with the young artists was to give them lessons in typography and calligraphy, in Hebrew, of course. And one of the teachers at the Bezalel, his name was Yaakov Stark. And Yaakov Stark, just to show you an example, was doing all kinds of exercises that he gave to his students of how to make illustrations or how to make decorations with the Hebrew alphabet. And here I circled for you the letter Shin, and you can see what he was doing as decorations with the letter Shin. And a very important thing that I have to mention about Bezalel, is that Bezalel was a secular school. Or if we take Bezalel as a microcosmos and we try to think what was going on in Jewish Palestine, this is the first time that the Hebrew alphabet, or not the first time, but one of the significant times, that the Hebrew alphabet is serving poetry and literature that has nothing to do with religion or has nothing to do with holy scriptures. So I'm just showing you here the 2 logos of Bezalel. The one on the right is the old logo by the days of Boris Schatz. And then in 1929, the school closed for 6 years, I believe, and then reopened in 1935. And the new head of the Bezalel school was the same Joseph Butko that I talked to you about him before. And you can see that the one on the right is really Art Nouveau. It looks like Art Nouveau. And the one on the left, which is more modern, is really modeled after the Bauhaus in Germany. And this is just to show you one of the calligraphy and typography classes in Bezalel. And this is a poster from Bezalel. But the interesting thing here, I think, is this is a very favorite poster of mine, designed by two brothers. This is the brothers Shamir, who were great designers in Jewish Palestine. This is an advertisement for shaving razors. But you can see that the Hebrew letters there are very like square-like, and nothing that you have seen so far, not the Frank Grill, not anything else, and it is very much like a Bauhaus advertisement. And this is another one that I really like, and you can see how the Hebrew writing, this is for the Levant Fair in, 1934, that was in Tel Aviv, but you can see that the letters are really like poster letters. They're really saying something, and they have to do both with the Bauhaus and also with Russian constructivists. If you know the Hebrew alphabet, and when you look at it very closely, you can see how different it is with different designs. This is the logo for Haaretz until 1933. You can see that it is very Art Nouveau-like. And the next one is designed by Franziska Baruch, and if you buy Haaretz, which I get every day at home, the logo is still the same from 1933, which, 80 years. And if you just look at the last letter of the word Haaretz, this is the final tzaddik. And what Franziska Baruch was doing here, the letter tzaddik has to be very long. It has to go out of the line. But she put it inside the line, which makes it a very strong, intriguing something, and this is why it is so powerful, I think. And just to show you how letters can be different, this is a logo for a newspaper called Al HaMishmar. And you can see that it says, Letzionut, Lesozialism, Leachvat Amim. This is a very left-wing newspaper in Israel in the 1950s. And if you just look at the letter Hey of Al HaMishmar and the letter Hey in Haaretz, they're completely different. And something else that I want to show you is the most revered political statement that we have in Israel, which is the Declaration of Independence. And because Israel does not have a constitution, this is the most important thing that we still have. And many people and many scholars were writing their analysis of what is the contents of the Declaration of Independence. But instead of reading the contents of the Declaration of Independence, I was looking at it. And if you look at the text, I'm showing you the text here, and then I will show you something. It is much larger that you can see. I discovered that the two people who wrote this is calligraphy, they wrote it by hand, they were with a complete obsession with the letter Lamed. And you can see here how many Lameds they have, and the Lamed is the longest letter. And I think one of the reasons, I could never talk to them because they passed away many years ago, but I believe that they were fascinated with the letter Lamed because it gives rhythm, rhythmus to the text of the Declaration of Independence. Something else that you have to take into consideration, that if we talk, let's say, about the United States, and you have two basic big political parties there, you have and the symbols of the political parties are either a donkey or an elephant. But when you go to Israel, the political parties have symbols with the Hebrew alphabet. And you can tell, I'm sure that all of you can tell, especially here, what is the model for the letter Aleph and the letter Mem with the sheaves of corn, that it is taken straight from Soviet models. One more thing that I want to mention is the modern typographers. And by modern, I think they're from the 20th century. One great typographer who worked on a typeface is Henry Friedlander, and he worked, I think, for 25 years on the development of the letter Hadassah. And Hadassah was one of the first typefaces that you could use. When I think about it, it's like in the Middle Ages when you had electric typewriters. The first letter in Hebrew for the electric typewriter before the computer was Hadassah. And another one is Itamar or Ismar David. This is David, or this is the, how do you say Schrift? This is the typeface David. And if you write on the computer in Israel, the first typeface that the computer gives you is David. Then you can change it if you want, but the first most popular thing is David. And you can see here how simple it is when it is compared on the left with the Francril, which is more ancient in a way. Other thing that I'd like to show you is something that they did in the Bezalel School of Arts and Crafts. And this Avi Eisenstein, who is still, I think, a professor at the Bezalel Art School, did a series of exercises with his students about Hebrew typography. And one of the problems that he was trying to approach with his students is how Hebrew typography or how Hebrew letters correspond to Latin letters. So you can see here two examples of what they did. But a very interesting thing, I think, as a final project of a Bezalel student was that he tried to do research on the ancient Hebrew alphabet that I was talking to you about, that I told you before. And what he did in his final project, he looked at some archaeological findings, looked at the Hebrew alphabet, and made a design of the ancient Hebrew alphabet for the computer. And he made this thing that you have on your handout. What he did in his final project is he showed how beautiful and very intricate the ancient Hebrew alphabet was all about. Now, I'd like to give you another example of how the Hebrew alphabet can speak or can say something. This is the logo of what used to be a political movement in Israel called Shalom Achshav, or Peace Now. You see that the Shalom Achshav is made of two typefaces. The word Shalom, is made by the Koren typeface. And this is Mr. Koren, who also worked something like 15 or 20 years on the invention of the Koren typeface. Today, the official Bible of Israel is called the Koren Bible. It is named after this man, this typographer who invented the Koren letter. And you can see that the Koren typeface is on the top, and then the Francril is on the bottom. You can see that the Koren typeface is a little more, or I think much more festive, very much noble in a way. So this is the word Shalom in Koren. And this is the word Achshav. And this is done in the letter Chaim. This is the typeface Chaim, which is completely different than Koren. So if we look again at the Shalom Achshav, this David Tartakover, the designer David Tartakover, made this thing that I think every Israeli who reads Hebrew can see the nobility of the word Shalom, and can see the thing that when you say Achshav, which is now, in the typeface of Chaim. What I'm showing you here is a poster from 1948 from the government of Israel for the Israeli citizens to do something which doesn't, it's not important what, but this is a poster that you had in the streets. And on the left you can see something, a small poster or a small brochure that Egyptian airplanes were throwing in the south of Israel during the 1948 war, telling the Israeli citizens to surrender to Egypt. But if you look at it from a visual point of view, the Egyptian poster was written in Bodoni, was printed in Bodoni typeface. And it looks much more religious in character because simply for a very simple fact, they didn't have modern typefaces, Hebrew typefaces in Egypt, and this is why they printed it as if they're printing a book of the Bible. I found this picture in the Haaretz newspaper about 3 weeks ago, interview with a very young typographer who invented or designed 30 new Hebrew typefaces. Now, I would like to finish my lecture or to move to something else and show you as much as I can how Israeli artists who are Hebrew-speaking people are using the Hebrew alphabet in their works of art. And one of them is this Drora Domini, who made an exhibition at the Tel Aviv Museum, about 20 years ago. And she had a series of sculptures. And as you can see, this is called tab with Hebrew punctuation. And what you see here is the punctuation of the Hebrew, but with no letters. And the interesting thing that happened to me, and I think to many other people who walked into this exhibition, was that we tried to read the sculptures. What I tried to do is, this is something that there is a, and then again and e, and u, and o. It's the vowels. But you had the audience in this exhibition, some of them were saying o, a, u, a, u, a, o, and they tried to read the sculptures, and others were competing with them, and they added letters to it, so it would be tse tse tsu tsi tsi, di di do de de, and things like that. Okay, and there's another example. This is a very, I think, clever Israeli artist who unfortunately is no longer with us. His name is Michael Sgan Cohen. And he made this small, very small painting, but I think interesting for Hebrew-speaking audience, and it's called Kamatz Patach. And what you see here on the right is the punctuation in Hebrew that's called, in Hebrew it's called the punctuation that says a, and this is called Kamatz. And on the left you have another punctuation mark which is also says a, which is called Patach. But the word in Hebrew, Kamatz, has also a meaning except for the punctuation mark. And Kamatz means that somebody's hand was open, and this is Kamatz. He closed his hand. And if you have your hand like this and you go like this is Patach. This is to open. So what he's doing here, he's using meta language for the Hebrew, and which makes a joke or makes a pun on the Hebrew word. There's something else by Michael Sgan Cohen. It's a series of 4 paintings. And the 4 painting series is called Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. So what he's doing here, the upper one is the letter Yud, and how you hold your mouth with the letter Yud. Then the next one is the letter Hey. Then the next one is the letter Vav, and the last one is also the letter Hey, which together, he is not saying it, but if we look at it and we read it, I can say it, but certain people in the Jewish tradition cannot say it. This spells Yehovah, and Yehovah is the name of God. And when I was looking at this painting, so this is, in a way, Michael Sgan Cohen is pronouncing the name of God, but he's not pronouncing the name of God, he's showing it visually. Just for an anecdote, I was showing this painting, or this series of paintings. I was in Houston, Texas, and I showed this thing in a different lecture that I gave. And at the end of the lecture, the dean of the School of Languages came to me and said, why does the hey, which is the second mouth, here is different than the hey on the bottom? And I must say that I didn't know what to answer, but then I waited about, 45 seconds, and it came to me. And the answer is that the first hey is pronounced, and the last hey is silent. So this is why they're different. Another example of doing something with playing around with the Hebrew language and with the Hebrew alphabet is just the name of this artist is something. Her name is Hila Lululin. And the name of the work is, in Hebrew, it's Ptsatsa Metaktek Tek Teket, or in English, it's tick 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 ticking bomb. So you see that she repeated the letters Taf and Kuf more times than supposed to be metakteket. So this is something like onomatopoeia of making the ticking bomb that unfortunately every little child in Israel know what is going on. One other thing is another thing by David Tartakover, and this is a poster he did in 1989. And the interesting thing is that when you show this to Israelis, most people would read it as Ke'ev. There are 3 letters here, Kaf, Aleph, and Bet, and it would spell Ke'ev. But also you can read this, and this is my interpretation, Ke'av. And Ke'av is different than Ke'ev. Ke'av means like a father. And the reason I think that he did that, there was a political thing that happened in Israel many, many years ago, when a little Palestinian girl was shot in her eye, and it was a sensation all over Israel, and he made this poster of this little Palestinian girl. So when he said Ke'ev is okay, because this is the pain of seeing something like this that's happening to a little girl. But he also, I know him personally, he has a daughter. So I would interpret it as if he said, I look at it like a father. And you can do all these language games just because we don't use the punctuation, so you can read it as you wish. Another example by David Tartakover, who is a great typographer and a great graphic designer, he made this poster for the film Shoah, or the Holocaust, that was shown many years ago at the Tel Aviv Museum. And you can see what he did with the letter Aleph. He was just taking the letter Aleph and turning it a few degrees to the left, and it would remind us, in a way, of a swastika. A woman artist did something very interesting with the Hebrew alphabet. She made a video of a performance that she did. And what she was using is a piece of glass and honey. And what she did was a series of sentences in Hebrew that are all taken from the Bible. And what she's referring to is a very well-known Jewish tradition with small children. When the very Orthodox Jewish children come to the Cheder, when they come to study in school, when they're 3 years old, in order to make them love the Hebrew alphabet, every time they look at the Hebrew alphabet, there is honey there, and they're supposed to lick it. And this is how they love the Hebrew alphabet. But she also has some kind of small protest as being a woman and saying that she is not allowed, according to Jewish Orthodox laws, to do this thing, and so she permits herself to do it. I think that this is my last example. There is a very, well, she's not so young anymore. There was a young Israeli artist, and her name is Zoya Tchaikovsky. You can all believe where she came from to Israel, and she was a great student at Bezalel. And something that she did not too long ago was she was making a modern Pesach, Passover Haggadah. And you can see here that what she's doing is a modern version of the Haggadah. First of all, she did everything by hand, so it is all calligraphy. She wrote the text by hand, but she's all the time referring to Russian models. And you can see that she's referring to Malevich, to the red square of Malevich that really suits the theme of blood. And this is again Malevich, and she's referring to darkness, to Chosh. And this is another page. You can see that she's doing her own calligraphy for the Pesach, for the Passover Haggadah. It could be Russian constructivism, that's for sure. And this is really my final gift to you. This is a 100 shekel banknote from Israel, issued by the Bank of Israel in 1996. And you can see that it has the portrait of the second president of Israel, Yitzhak Ben Tzvi. But we come to 1999, only 3 years later, there is a new Israeli banknote for 100 shekels. And you can see that they're almost the same. The portrait of the president is from 1996. It's the same president with the glasses. But if you look very closer, and you don't even need a magnifying glass, you can see that the portrait of President Yitzhak Ben Tzvi is made of Hebrew letters Bet and Tzadik, Ben Tzvi. This is the first letters of his last name. You look at the 50 shekel banknote. This is Shai Agnon, the famous Israeli author who won the Nobel Prize. And you can see that his face is made of the letters Shin and Ayin. I was thinking to myself, why? Why would the banknote of the Bank of Israel would have the Hebrew alphabet on his head? And I was reminded myself of Hebrew micrography that I showed you before. And I would like just to end to show you that just 2 months ago or 1 month ago, the Bank of Israel announced in Israeli newspapers that they're going to have new banknotes for new Israeli shekels. On one of them, as you see on the top, is going to be Hebrew Israeli poet Shaul Tchaikovsky, and on the bottom is going to be a portrait of Nathan Alterman, both poets in Israel. What the Bank of Israel already published in the newspaper was only the proposal, not the final banknote, but the proposal for the note. And when you look very closely at Shaul Tchaikovsky portrait, you can see that the way his face is delineated is very close to George Washington on the American dollar. I mean, it's the same way of having a print, like in a very classical print. But who knows if this is going to be the last decision of the Bank of Israel? I don't know. And this is really my question, because I don't know what the Bank of Israel is going to do. It all depends who is going to tell them. Thank you very much.